Yes.
So our next topic of discussion is prompted by a tweet we received from a listener. So thank you very much. And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing this, but Branavan Candia said on February 22nd, Trish and Sarah, I don't know if you do listener topics, but I'm curious to know you guys' thoughts on the current idea that Meltzer is losing his edge or has lost it. So Branavan, thank you so much for asking. We do listener questions when they are topics that we're interested in, and this one spoke to us, and we decided to discuss it. So a lot of this is coming up is based around a couple things. So we alluded to this briefly on our last episode, but about 2 weeks ago in the Wrestling Observer, Dave Meltzer kind of had one of those periodic occurrences for him where he reports something in the Observer that people are like, that's wrong. And he takes a lot of heat and aggravation and people talking at him about like what he was wrong. In this case, it was a remark. It was a written remark in the Observer that there was a rule that CMLL talent could not appear on the same television show as AAA talent, even though that was sort of shown to be, at least people felt it was false because I think Commander had a promo on an episode of Rampage that a CMLL wrestler was on. So people were like, again, as often happens with Meltzer and some of the stuff he talks about was like, ha, gotcha! Like, whoa! Sometimes with these folks, I sort of want to see, I flash back to the Mission Accomplished banner, and I always want to post that as a GIF, like, Mission Accomplished, we got him! Like, whoa, he was wrong one time, wow. And the second one was Dave reported that Tommy Dreamer had taken over as the sort of head of creative for TNA, with Scott D'Amore being let go. And that was sort of refuted in like 3 separate places that there was actually a booking committee that Tommy Dreamer was on. But then it was sort of came up that it was maybe, it is a booking committee, but Tommy Dreamer has a more outsized voice in it than other people would say. So again, not necessarily this kind of like, he completely misreported what he was talking about, but he, got like a slight detail wrong or a small thing different, or he used a word he probably would have been better off using, wrestled rather than appeared when it came to the CMLL. Yep. I think Voices of Wrestling did a really good rundown 2 weeks ago on why the criticism was a little bit overly zealous, I guess. But I kind of find this topic fascinating because I do think that there are some valid criticisms of Dave Meltzer fairly recently, but these are not them. And I want to preface this by saying that, like, first of all, who the fuck am I to criticize Dave Meltzer? The man is like, you can ignore half of what I say here because, like, again, who the fuck am I? The guy's been doing this for 50 some odd years. He reports this stuff every week. He does multiple like radio programs on a weekly basis. And I can tell you from just doing this little podcast for like 12 episodes that it's hard to like think on your feet and come up with topics and not sound like a dick and not be a jerk. Like, these are all really challenging things. So like on that note, like I'd like to kind of temper that criticism with all that stuff. And I hope you guys will remember this as I continue to talk about this. But I do think there's a couple things that probably we could get into in terms of, how Dave reports some things and the difference between what he reports on in the newsletter and what he talks about on Wrestling Observer Radio, because I think that's a lot of where some of the criticism comes into play. And I think media literacy is also something that a lot of wrestling fans are missing. So many wrestling fans seem to be completely unaware of the idea that Trish could tell me today that she plans to go out to lunch with a friend, and then tomorrow could tell someone else that she didn't go out to lunch with that friend. And both of those things could be true because she could have had a plan to go to lunch and that plan could change, to use the age-old words of the meme. And like, that's one of those things that I think, people tell Meltzer stuff and then stuff does change or happen and people get mad at him that he misreported it. And it's like, well, he was telling you what he knew to be true at the time. And that's not even getting into the old carny side of wrestling, which is people always trying to work an angle and trying to, basically get Dave to report shit for their own reasons. And we saw that so much in 2022 and 2023 with CM Punk and all of the punk camp, as it were. So I think that's kind of an important thing also to remember. So I guess, part of the reason I think where Dave takes so much criticism is because there's no one else doing it the way he does it. I don't think there's a single other person as prominent as him in wrestling media. Wade Keller does a lot of some of the similar stuff that Dave does, but he never seems to take any of the heat that Dave takes on a regular basis.
Nobody sees it. Unless he writes it, nobody actually sees it. Yeah.
Right.
And there's a lot.
Obviously,
Sometimes there is actually more kind of controversial detail or things that can be kind of checked against, and it just doesn't get picked up on.
no, it's fascinating. You also have Sean Ross Sapp, obviously, in Fightful Select, but they don't do a lot of analysis. They do very little deep analysis or very little sort of deep thought. It's very kind of quick hit, like, here's what we are hearing. Here's
TikTok news.
TikTok news is the perfect way to describe it.
Yeah.
So, there's really nobody else who does it. And I want to say that I think one of the things that I think Dave does better than anybody else is that I trust that when I'm reading something in the Wrestling Observer newsletter, that Dave is telling me the most accurate and least biased opinion of that journalism than anybody else. And I think folks will disagree with me on this, and this is probably the part we get pushed back on the most. But if you think about somebody like this is something that comes up a lot, right? People always say Brian Last has sources. This is always a thing that comes up whenever somebody says Brian Last said it. Brian Last has sources. We get told this quite frequently. I believe 100% that someone like Brian Last has sources, absolutely. But I also don't know that I trust Brian Last to tell me a thing that he himself personally doesn't agree with, right? So if there's 20 people talking to Brian Last and 18 of them say the Young Bucks are an incredible tag team, everybody loves them backstage, they do incredible work, they're beloved, and 2 people say the Young Bucks suck, everybody hates them, I sort of think that Brian Last will tell me that the Young Bucks suck and everybody hates them. And I think that's kind of the big difference between someone like him and someone like Dave Meltzer, right? And I'm saying Brian Last specifically because there's a bias there that everybody's sort of aware of, right? But I think Dave is a little bit better at not allowing his biases to influence his reporting. That said, I don't think that is the case all of the time. And I think you can kind of see when that comes into play. And I think for me, the stuff that I would say I could probably criticize has been more recently with the stuff he's talked about with the most recent stuff with The Rock and Triple H, right? And the whole Cody Rhodes storyline and the way that broke down. It seemed to me like there was almost a lot of the discussion on the radio was well, this has to be true. And the attempt to reconcile the two very different stories that seem to be coming from The Rock and Triple H in regards to how the Cody Rhodes angle came about, whether it was always the plan, whether it wasn't. Dave himself at times seemed to be really confused about this. And as a result, it was kind of I'm not sure what's going on here, I guess is the best way to describe it. I'm sort of floundering a little bit with this, Trish, in terms of, talk to me about what you think. You were like, I disagree. I'm going to argue the opposite. Which we've discussed 12 times is my favorite part of any conversation is when we disagree. So do you think that there's any issues that Meltzer's had, and are they more recent or are they things that have occurred consistently throughout his reporting time?
I think there's probably things that would be consistent about in his reporting time, or things he overlooks. And some of that's like an old school mentality, and it's very hard to kind of remove yourself from that and see things in a kind of a modern kind of outlook. But look, I think it's very, very difficult. I think wrestling news in general is very, very difficult. Yes. I think there are very few actual reporters. And a lot of people get away with writing 4 or 5 words on something, or we'll just tell you where this location is going to be, where it's going to be. And I don't know if that's enough. You're looking for people that deliver depth for me when it comes to wrestling journalism. And, the only people that really write a lot of long form stuff that's actually kind of good analysis is Dave over at The Observer, and then John Pollock and Brandon Thurston over at Post. And, you get the odd thing coming from like Voices of Wrestling. But I guess the thing is about a lot of this for me is it's not even about what he writes. So in terms of the one that sparked all this, so there's been a few things that sparked it, right? So you have the CMLL thing, whereas if he wrote the word wrestle, like he wrote later in a tweet, appear to wrestle, then we wouldn't even have this discussion. As Voices of Wrestling summed up quite nicely. Yes. And the same with the Tommy Dreamer thing. So by the look of it, he is the head of the booking committee. People pointed out that he did the phone call to TNA Talent after Scott DeMore was fired. He also is the one that people have been told to contact from other businesses, sponsors and the like. And it's very clear that he'll end up kind of probably being right on that, but it's just about terminology. And then there was I think the Triple H Rock segment where somebody had sent him the segment, but most of us just kind of looked past it and went, well, they are kind of teasing a Triple H Rock match, and that is a bigger match, and they need to be careful with that. So we just kind of went, well, that's a stupid mistake. Should have been picked up by an editor. Whereas other people just kind of focus on it. It becomes this thing. Yes. Actually, the most important thing in that whole issue of The Observer was the long form write-up on the Ashley Mazzara situation.
Right.
That was the most important thing in the Observer that week. That was the thing that had, the most valuable content, that's going to be the biggest story that is currently in wrestling. But we didn't see that because, one, it's behind a paywall. And this is a general movement we have in media, not just in wrestling, that with the way that financially kind of business and news reporting is changing, we're seeing more and more kind of the detail and the analysis content and even the standard reporting moving behind a paywall. So what you've got left as free content sometimes is AI generated, a lot of time is aggregation. So you don't get that kind of detail and analysis unless you pay for it. So we're restricting that news flow. So what people's opinions are of people and opinions of their writing in a lot of ways is often tended by how it's interpreted by somebody else and how it's delivered to somebody else. Right. So let's be clear. I fucking hate aggregation.
Yes.
I hate it. I cannot hate it any more than I hate it. It drives me up the wall because what's being reported sometimes by these reporters is often lost, and then follow-up is missed, and you get no context.
Yes.
So you're getting no context report. So just do an easy one, right? So thinking about things from the summer that are easy to do. So do you remember, there's a couple ones. So do you remember when Dave said the atmosphere after the first collision wasn't great, and everybody went, oh no, it's fine, because all these news reports went out to PW Insider, to other places that kind of said, oh no, everything's great, everything's fine.
Vibes backstage are great. The vibes backstage are great. Right?
Yeah, what happens 3 months later? Yeah, 3 months later, we find out they weren't all great.
No.
So people are very quick to jump on something like that. But then there's just loads of easy ones. So take the Adam Page being barred from the building thing. Okay? Yep. So Dave breaks that story, and that's aggregated. PW Insider are then fed that it was just moved locations, and people believe that. Right? Yep. And that gets aggregated. And that's where people believe the story is. Dave then puts out, and I always think about this because it's so rare anything on Page gets out, that he had the text message that said, don't come to the building to keep the peace. So he's like, give the evidence. Was that aggregated? No, never aggregated. Right? And there were so many things that weekend, even up to like the Jack Perry stuff, where we aggregated the Punk story that went to Sean Ross Sapp that he said came from him. Yep. But we didn't aggregate the stuff that came from Brian Alvarez, where we found out, the way he was talking in his complete condescending manner, that, was the behavior that people expected that had happened previously with Punk. And then the fact that he was, had already had it approved and was on vacation. So how these stories are kind of interpreted and what people believe is all based off aggregation. And it's the same with, the recent Hangman thing. And Hangman's a hard one because he doesn't communicate everything with everybody. No. It's what people don't get. So when people think he might be injured, that would absolutely be put out there. And we've seen some things in the past where he has not manipulated media, but ensured that his privacy was protected. Right. So people jump us around that, and the next day, Sap puts out, he's not injured, he's fine. And then, Geraldine endorses it. But then Alvarez and Meltzer do their kind of work and say, actually, it's a personal issue. Brian talks about how serious it is. None of that gets aggregated. So you are judging these reporters, not on the actual content. You're not reading the content. You're not reading it in, with its where it should sit. What's the content around it? You're just reading tiny little snippets that have very little value to me. And it's so frustrating. So, he will make mistakes. He produces far more content than anybody else each week. Yep. Nobody produces that level of content, especially written content. And whatever you think of his written content, is an absolutely invaluable news source. It's an invaluable data source. And the analysis, the top pieces are, and they do tend to be right. And on the big stories in the last year, I think he's beaten everybody, the All-In stuff, the TV deal. He's run circles around people when it's actually mattered. And he is more neutral than anybody else. All In straight afterwards. That puts Punk story straight up. He didn't wait and see what the other side was. They just put the Punk story up. So people are shaped by that. But I do get this funny thing where people say, I only believe like one journalist.
So
I only
dumb.
believe PW Insider. I only believe Sean Ross Sapp. I only believe Dave Meltzer. I only believe, I don't know, I think it's some more Wade Keller. And it's like everybody talks to different people. This is a huge industry, and everybody's working some sort of agenda So sometimes, and we've seen this with so many things in the last year, you need to build up a picture, and just believing one person or that information is not going to give you that picture. You don't get, I don't know, say like a huge political kind of thing, happening somewhere. You don't often get that picture from one journalist who has one viewpoint. Something major happens, you read as much news as you can, and you tend to look at different outlets, try and move to different things. And, it's getting harder and harder. News media is under enormous threat. We just seen Vice,
right? Great
investigative media outlet, who are no more. Tim Marchman, we spoke about previously, has been a huge kind of voice so far in the Vince McMahon investigation kind of reporting, and that doesn't exist anymore. So we are losing a standard in media, and we are also becoming ultra reliant on aggregation because more things are moving behind the paywall. And this is just a general thing, but it is meaning that the ability to think for yourself and to put pictures together, or even to go and listen to content yourself. A lot of the time the content is on, the Observer will put that main segment up on YouTube, and people don't go and listen to that. They just believe the aggregation. How many times have we listened to something on audio, especially with Dave? Dave's is the easiest one to think about. But how many times have we listened to something on audio and there'll be like a passing comment? And actually, when we've looked into that passing comment, it's a bigger news story than anything that's said that's been aggregated.
Yes.
We've got to think probably about 5-6 times in the last year, the major news story wasn't anything that was reported. It was something that was a little comment, and then you go and find that story and it's huge. So, people that often listen to a lot of different, we listen to a lot of different journalists because that way you can kind of get that more rounded story. And it's like, people say about Wade Keller. I don't always agree with Wade Keller, but I listen to him because the viewpoints that he's getting from people in WWE and Tom Martin similar as well are different. And actually they make me challenge. And I like people that challenge my thought process. I've said this of Joe Lanza as well, Voices of Wrestling. It's like, challenge my thought process, make me think differently, make me put all the picture together, not just, I only believe this person, because actually you're only kind of getting a quarter of things. You're never getting the full picture. And I just think it's getting more and more dangerous in that aspect.